And for Europe, this is a problem. Wherever I go, I found myself confronted with the accusation of double standards. I used to say to my ambassadors that diplomacy is the art of managing double standards. Certainly something difficult, but it is about to manage double standards.
The European Union's foreign policy chief has admitted that Europe's policies are deeply hypocritical and are based on double standards. This was said by Josep Borrell, who is the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. He was speaking at Oxford University, and he acknowledged that Europe is hypocritical and sometimes violates international law, and yet criticizes other countries for violating international law. He acknowledged that this is a double standard, and he said that the art of diplomacy is the art of managing double standards. So he was admitting that Europe's foreign policy is based fundamentally on hypocrisy, and he in particular acknowledged the fact that numerous countries in Europe supported the illegal US-led invasion of Iraq, and he also acknowledged that Europe was supporting Israel in committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza, and yet Europe expected the world to support Ukraine, portraying Russia as an evil boogeyman. So here's this very revealing clip in which the top EU foreign policy official acknowledges their deep hypocrisy.
And then there is international humanitarian law to try to regulate how wars are fought and safeguard the protection of civilians. And this principle should be the best safeguards against the normalization of the use of force that we see all over the world. And I know, however, that to be able to rally the world around those principles, we need to show that we, Europeans, we respect them always and everywhere. Is that what we are doing? Well, not to the extent we should. And for Europe, this is a problem. Wherever I go, I found myself confronted with the accusation of double standards. I used to say to my ambassadors that diplomacy is the art of managing double standards. Certainly something difficult, but it is about to manage double standards. But the fact is, people around the world have not forgotten the war in Iraq. Even if some European Union member states did not participate, others participated with a lot of enthusiasm, and others withdraw quickly of this war. This is the case of the country I know best. And what is now happening in Gaza has portrayed Europe in a way that many people simply don't understand. They saw our quick engagement and decisiveness in supporting Ukraine and wonder about the way we approach to what is happening in Palestine.
There you can hear that Borrell mentioned three different issues that the EU has been very hypocritical on: the Iraq war, Israel's brutal war crimes in Gaza, and the war in Ukraine. He then continued acknowledging that Western governments give the impression that Ukrainian lives are more valuable than Palestinian lives.
But the perception is that the value of civilian lives in Ukraine is not the same that in Gaza, where more than 34,000 civilians are dead, most others displaced, children are starving, and the humanitarian support obstructed. And the perception is that we care less.
And he admitted that Europe is deeply hypocritical in the UN Security Council, criticizing Russia for violating resolutions, but saying nothing as Israel constantly violates resolutions.
United Nations Security Council resolutions are violated, as it is the case by Israel with respect to settlements, or when it's being violated by Russia. Yes, the principles that we put in place after the World War are a pillar of peace, but these require that we are coherent in our language. If we call something a war crime in one place, we need to call it by the same name when it happens anywhere else. And we all agree that Hamas sparked this new cycle of violence with their atrocious attacks that we have to condemn once and again. But what has happened in Gaza after 6 months is another horror. And one horror cannot justify another. This is more and more what our societies are feeling as the passionate debates and the many demonstrations around the world, and in particular in the US, are showing.
The EU foreign policy chief likewise acknowledged that the West is very hypocritical on climate change. He admitted that Europe and also North America have been responsible for the majority of carbon emissions throughout history. And meanwhile, countries in the global south, like in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, are only responsible for a tiny percentage of carbon emissions historically. And yet the Western powers are trying to put the burden on the global south for the green transition away from fossil fuels, despite the fact that they're not responsible, and despite the fact that the global south is already disproportionately suffering from the consequences of climate change that was caused by the wealthy colonizing capitalist countries in the global north. Here is this very revealing clip as well.
And then we have to have a look at why the world is feeling some resentment about us. Yes, there is a feeling of resentment because people believe that there are different responsibilities. Let me cite only two of them. First, climate change. We Europeans, we have produced about 25% of all cumulated global CO2 emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Africa, 3%. Latin America, 3%. Sub-Saharan Africa and South Americans, almost nothing of the responsibility, and they shared the most important and damaging consequences. So when we talk about fighting climate change, we have to understand their views and the feeling that this is a problem that someone has created and others pay the consequences. And the only possible answer is to provide more resources in order to face this problem. More resources. But it has not been the case.
Now, it is very refreshing to hear a Western official speak so honestly, but we should not kid ourselves. Josep Borrell is definitely not an angel. In fact, on the contrary, he has been a pretty horrible foreign policy chief for the European Union. He was appointed in 2019 for a 5-year term. So at the end of 2024, he will be finishing his term. And in these years, he oversaw the proxy war in Ukraine. And in the same speech, he called for sending more and more weapons to Ukraine. And in fact, in another very revealing comment, he acknowledged that if it were not for Western support, the war in Ukraine would end just in a few months because Ukraine cannot fight without Western military support and weapons. Here is a very revealing clip in which he acknowledges that the Western powers are responsible for fueling this war, and he insists that they must continue sending more weapons to Ukraine because they cannot allow Russia to win. So essentially, They're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. Listen here.
The Ukrainian existence depends on us. I know how to finish the war in Ukraine. I can finish the war in Ukraine in a couple of weeks, just by cutting the supply. If I cut the supply of arms to Ukraine, Ukraine cannot resist. They will have to surrender, and the war will finish. But is this the way we want the war finished? I don't want. And I hope that many people around Europe doesn't want neither. By the contrary, we will do whatever we can in order to provide the Ukrainians with the military and political support.
So Josep Borrell is by no means an anti-war activist or a peace supporter. He very much is a European imperialist, but he's an interesting politician because over the past few years, he has had a few moments in which he spoke very bluntly, very honestly about reality. In February 2024, Borrell published an article that was shockingly blatant in which he acknowledged that, quote, the era of Western dominance has indeed definitively ended. He warned that the Western powers have been trying to divide the world into, quote, the West against the rest. And he acknowledged that, quote, many in the global South accuse us of double standards. I did a video and a report about that, which I will link to in the description below. In fact, in the speech that Borrell delivered at Oxford University, which I began this analysis today by looking at, in that speech, he made another very similar remark. He acknowledged that the United States has lost its status as the global hegemon.
I see the international system that we were accustomed to after the Cold War no longer exist. America has lost its status of a hegemon.
And he conceded that China's rise has fundamentally reshaped the global economy. And today, China represents nearly 20% of the world's economy when its GDP is measured at purchasing power parity, whereas the US only represents around 14%, and the European Union represents under 16%. And this is a massive shift from just 30 years ago, when China only made up 5% of the global economy, and the US and the EU each represented around 20% of world GDP. Here is this clip from the EU foreign policy chief.
I see, as you know, China rising to the superpower status. What China has done in the last 40 years is a unique in the history of mankind. In the last 30 years, China's share of the world GDP at PPP has gone from 6% to almost 20%, while we Europeans, we went from 21 to 14%, and the US from 20 to 15. This is a dramatic change on the economic landscape. And China is becoming a rival for us and for the US, not just in manufacturing cheap goods, but also as a military power, as the forefront of technological development, and building the technologies that will shape our future. China has embarked in a friendship without limits, although all friendships has limits, with Russia, which signals a growing alignment of the authoritarian regimes in front of democracies.
In that same speech at Oxford, the EU foreign policy chief acknowledged that the world is becoming more and more multipolar as Western hegemony has declined. And in particular, he discussed the BRICS countries and how they refuse to simply pick a side in the new Cold War that the West is waging, trying to divide the world into blocs. Instead, countries like Brazil, India, South Africa, Turkey, they are refusing to simply pick a side, and they are maintaining a non-aligned foreign policy and maximizing their autonomy, as he said.
I said the world is much more multipolar. Yes, that's true. Middle powers, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Turkey, are emerging. They become important actors. Whether they are BRICS or not BRICS, they have very few common features, except the desire of getting more status and a stronger voice in the world, as well as a greater benefit for their own development. And in order to achieve this, they are maximizing their autonomy, not willing to take side, hedging one side or the other.
In another very revealing comment that Borrell made back in 2022, he pushed back against this idea that has been promoted by US President Joe Biden that the new Cold War that the US is leading against China and Russia is a so-called battle between democracy and autocracy. And the EU foreign policy chief admitted in this rare moment of honesty that in reality, that there are many autocratic authoritarian regimes on the West side. The West has many authoritarian allies. It is not a battle between so-called democracy and autocracy.
This will coexist with a broader democracies versus authoritarians, a big divide. I wouldn't insist a lot on it, because in our side, there are a lot of authoritarian regimes. We cannot say we are the democracies, and the ones who follow us are also democracy. That's not true. That's not true.
In yet another revealing speech in 2022, Josep Borrell acknowledged that the West's prosperity in the neoliberal era and the era of US-dominated hegemony after the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the end of the First Cold War in the 1990s and 2000s. He acknowledged that in that era, the West's prosperity was based on China and Russia. Cheap consumer goods from China and the big Chinese market for Western exports, and also cheap energy, gas, and commodities from Russia. Here's yet another example of one of these revealing quotes from Josep Borrell.
So our prosperity was based on China and Russia, energy and market. US takes care of our security, China and Russia provide the basis of our prosperity. This is a world that is no longer there. I think that the Europeans were facing a situation in which we've suffered the consequences of a process that has been lasting for years, in which we have decoupled the sources of our prosperity from the sources of our security. This is a sentence to provide a headline. And I'm taking that from Oliver Schmidt, who has been developing this thesis, I think, quite well. Our prosperity has been based on cheap energy coming from Russia, Russian gas, cheap and suppose affordable and secure and stable, which has been proved not the case, and the access to the big China market for exports and imports, for technological transfer, for investment, and for having cheap goods. I think that the Chinese workers, with their low salaries, has done much better and much more to contain inflation than all the central banks together. So our prosperity was based on China and Russia, energy and market.
But like I said earlier, Borrell has in many ways been an awful foreign policy chief for the EU, because although he has said some of these very honest comments every now and then, he has also been blatantly racist and made other frank comments in which he revealed that many elites in Brussels and in the European Union overall, they see themselves as superior to the rest of the world. They think that the rest of the world consists of barbarians. And in a very racist rant in 2022, Josep Borrell claimed that Europe is an enlightened garden and the rest of the world is a jungle and that Europe had to protect itself from the barbarians in the rest of the world in the jungle. Now, this is, of course, incredibly hypocritical because as I began this analysis today showing, he admits that Europe is deeply hypocritical. It constantly violates international law. It allows its allies like Israel to violate international law when it's convenient and to commit war crimes. So in reality, Europe is just as much a jungle, if not more of a jungle, and the US is constantly waging wars around the world, overthrowing foreign governments with the support of European countries. So if anything, they're the barbarians in the jungle. But like I said, Josep Borrell, he's not an anti-imperialist by any stretch of the imagination. He is an imperialist. He is a warmonger, but he is one of these politicians, like Donald Trump, who every now and then admits something. He says the quiet part loud when most politicians know, they're smart enough to know they shouldn't say these kinds of things. Now, in the other speech at Oxford University in 2024, Borrell basically repeated this argument, and we can see an example of European exceptionalism. We know about American exceptionalism. Well, here is another example of very arrogant European exceptionalism in which Borrell claims that the European Union has created the best quality of life, the best social system ever in humanity.
Europe, the European Union, but more than the European Union, the way of living of the Europeans, this best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that the humanity has never been able to invent is certainly in danger. And in the meantime, to continue fighting to make the values and principles that make Europe what it is, I said at the beginning, the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that humanity has never been able to invent.
So as I wrap up, I just want to once again reiterate that Borrell has been quite reprehensible as an EU foreign policy chief, but I think it's very important and useful to look at some of these speeches that are given by European elites when they're speaking to fellow elites at universities like Oxford, because we can see what they actually say behind closed doors. He knew this was being recorded. He knew that the speech would be published. So I really want to hear what they say when they know they're not being republished and they're not being recorded. But again, we can, I think, learn a lot from listening to these comments that are made by European elites to see how they actually see the world. And we can understand that this very arrogant, imperialist, neo-colonialist view of the world is very much still alive, but they lament the fact that Western hegemony is in decline, which explains this very aggressive foreign policy against Russia, against China, against other countries, because the Western powers are desperately trying to grasp on to their declining hegemony. But as we discuss here at Geopolitical Economy Report, the world is becoming increasingly multipolar, which means more democratic in a true international democracy that's not simply controlled by the Western colonial powers who want to impose their will on the rest of the world in international dictatorship. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like, please share this, please subscribe, and I will see you all next time.